All right. So as Matt said, AppliedXL is a company staffed by computational journalists. Actually, a lot of us work together at the Wall Street Journal. And what we are focusing on is detecting early signals in data before they become news. And so we use the term pre-news to define this concept of there's information that is hidden in the public domain, if properly triangulated and documented, can anticipate what we refer as catalyst events. And everything will make sense in just a moment. Just a little bit of background. I think Matt mentioned my profile. My partner and co-founder, Aaron, we worked together at the Wall Street Journal, whereas I was the R&D chief and Aaron was the automation editor. Aaron is our CTO, and previously from joining the Wall Street Journal, he was automation engineer at Microsoft, and he also went through the dual program at Columbia in terms of combining computer science and journalism. So the company is staffed, as I mentioned, by computational journalists. And what that means is that there's always a healthy tension between engineering and data science, and then the journalistic perspective. And so the idea is, rather than building these systems for automation or event detection that are purely algorithmic, how can we inject the human perspective, the perspective of editors and journalists into how those models function? Long story short, Aaron and I were developing these types of tools at the Wall Street Journal, essentially helping our colleagues in the newsroom monitor different areas. And the methodology there was, ingesting large corpuses of text data and then building these systems for anomaly detection. As we were seeing the impact of these tools in a newsroom like the Wall Street Journal and enabling our colleagues to break stories ahead of the competition, we realized that there was an opportunity for us to build these types of systems, and in addition to providing them to journalists, providing them to industry practitioners. So think about operators in different industries, investors, and so on. So we left the Wall Street Journal early in 2020. We set this big, ambitious vision of being able to disrupt, being able to anticipate disruptions to the health of people, places, and planet. That's a fancy way of saying, like, we want to serve 3 different verticals. So life sciences, which is the health of people, supply chain and transportation, and then health of planet, touches on the energy and ESG space. So we left the journal early 2020, and then this big thing happened. The pandemic hit in full swing, and we thought, well, we are either going to go back to our jobs, or this is an opportunity for us to build a company. And so the immediate thing that we did as we were figuring out the different the specific capabilities we would build, is that we started looking at a lot of COVID data and basically building APIs for tracking COVID and the spread of the disease. And from tracking the spread of the disease, we started looking at the treatment landscape, so clinical trials, drug development. And as computational journalists, the way that we prototype a product or a new tool is actually building low touch APIs very quickly, and then being able to ask questions from the data using those APIs, and then publish stories as a way to validate if there's something there. So that's exactly what we did with clinical trials, where we looked at the landscape of clinical trials, and then we partnered with STAT, which is the leading medicine and biotech news publisher, to release that story in collaboration with one of the reporters. And what we did there was looking at the treatment, the clinical trial landscape, and the inefficiencies in coordinating clinical trials. And within 3 hours of publishing, we start getting, inbound emails from biotech companies, pharma companies, and the deputy director of the National Institute of Health himself asking, this is really compelling data. Would you mind updating it in a certain cut of the data so I can use this in internal presentation? And we then realized, well, there's something here. If all of these experts are requesting for that data, there's something here. And so I know a lot of you are interested in entrepreneurship and in innovation and experimentation. That was the way that we proved, there was an audience and appetite for our platform was based on a story. So that's what we are doing right now. We are focusing on this first vertical, which is life sciences, serving biotech and pharma companies, as well as life sciences investors, with an event detection platform for clinical trials. And you'll see what that looks like in just a second. Before I do that, I think it's important to mention 3 of the key pillars that guide our product development in our company. One is computational journalism, which is what I was mentioning about, like, this healthy tension between engineering and journalism perspective. And so our point of view is that as the world becomes more digitized and as all parts of different industries can be quantified, finding what's noteworthy will evolve into looking at statistical outliers while providing context. And so our definition of journalism, computational journalism, is very much focused on real-time data and being able to say, is this update relevant, and why is it relevant? The way we do that is through editorial algorithms. So rather than just building machine learning models that are that do not include a perspective of a journalist, what we do is that we sit down with journalists that are specialists in this first vertical, for example, in biotech, and we do knowledge transfer. What that means is that we encode their research processes and the way that they look at the data into a model. So there are things, for example, for clinical trials, we are detecting all sorts of updates in events. So let's say you're testing a drug on a number of patients, you might change the number of patients you're treating, or you might change the timeline of that clinical trial. All of those signals have very specific interpretation depending on the type of the disease, the type of drug you're evaluating. And so if you talk to a biotech journalist, they will know, like, the nuance of that. So we translate, there are things that are easier to translate from a journalistic question to a data science question. Others are a bit more abstract. So, like, upon looking at a new update on a clinical trial, a journalist might ask the question, is this medically ambitious? So there's also questions that are more conceptual, and a lot of the translation of that question into that journalistic question into data science is what we are focusing on. And then finally, the third pillar, or the third thing that we pay attention to, is pre-news. And so throughout this presentation, I think it's important to remember that we have a very specific point of view on this, which is the world we live in is comprised of a very large amount of events, but those events that can occur in the world are finite, and so they repeat themselves. And so if you take that as the organizing principle, then by tracking the signals that previously led to a certain occurrence, so like a clinical trial failing or a clinical trial succeeding, you can indeed anticipate the news. And so the approach here is not to try to look at the world as a blank canvas, is actually trying to compartmentalize the world in, like, smaller worlds. So that's why we are taking this incremental approach of, like, looking at clinical trials, then we'll look at supply chain, transportation, and so on. So What does this mean in a more visual way is that we developed algorithms that are tracking or monitoring different data sources. So like clinical trials that need to be reported to the regulatory agencies, announcements from companies, scientific papers. And we developed these algorithms that are looking and monitoring these data sources for very specific shifts in the data. So it could be there's shifts in timeline delays, more people are added to a clinical trial, the trial stops unexpectedly, the parameters of how the protocol of that clinical trial is shifted. All of those micro changes have very specific interpretation, and if combined together can actually anticipate a catalyst event. The catalyst event in this case is whether the trial is going to succeed or not. So one important thing to mention here is that pre-news doesn't stand for predictive, it stands for preemptive. Can you equip the people that are using this information to make decisions with information that reduces the uncertainty before this catalyst event? So if there's a bunch of red flags, you know, it could be an indicator that that clinical trial might fail, but we are not in the business of predicting, we are in the business of red flags. And so the idea or the analogy is your bank will message you if they find an irregularity between, you know, a wire transfer in your accounts, and it's basically, hey, you should look into this further. It's the same thing here, where we have investors and pharmaceutical companies monitoring different diseases, different competitors, and will alert them of these irregularities. And so the question that we ask for this domain is, what if you could anticipate the outcomes of clinical trials months ahead of time? So if you're a pharma company, you know, competing in this space, it can help you, you know, prepare your go-to-market or how you respond to a competitor. If you're an investor, you might make certain investment or divestment decisions. And so that's what we are doing, which is providing the entry point for this monitoring, and then it's up to the expert to decide what they do with this information. I'll show you the platform in just a second, but it's an alerting platform. And so this example that I'm showing you here is for this biotech company called Summit Therapeutics. And we detected this case study irregularities 3 months before the company then publicly said, actually, this clinical trial didn't go according to plan, and we then meet our endpoint. So our goals, we then reach the hypothesis that we were trying to prove. And so I'll call out some specifics here. So we are calling out that we've noticed that there's a substantial decrease in the number of patients that is being tested. And so the way that we know this is important is that we worked extensively with biotech journalists to know that every time something like this occurs, where you have less people to test the drug on, that might impact the statistical significance of the clinical trial. We also detected that there were many delays in the clinical trial, signaling that, well, they were trying to make adjustments or other shifts to how they were running it. Again, nowhere we say this is going to fail, but we are saying there's something here, and you should look into this. And so in this particular case, this is an example we share with our customers who are in the financial services space. Obviously, there is impact on the stock market, and there was, as a result of this, there was a 49% drop in the stock. So this is extremely complex to do, because on a daily basis, just in the US alone, there's between 6,000 to 7,000 updates every day. So like these little alerts that I was showing you that we are generating, there's a huge volume, and it's humanly impossible to keep up with these updates. And most importantly, not all of these updates are relevant, but those that are can actually dictate the future direction of a company, of finding a cure for a treatment, for a disease. And so these algorithms that we are developing have editorial principles embedded into them. So which it's looking at, is how often does this type of event occur? Is this an important study? How active is this type of disease and the research around that disease? So there's a lot of principles that we embed in the algorithms, which essentially translates in only about 8% of these updates being actually relevant. The way to think about this is we replicated, or we created models or machine learning models that are replicating to some extent the rigorous research process of biotech journalists. So we took 20 years of clinical trials data, and we looked from the start to completion of that clinical trial. What are the possible paths that the trial can go in terms of, like, it changes the status, or it shifts the number of patients it's testing, or it opens up a new location where they are administering the drug. There's a huge amount of possible variations, but we know what's an expected path and what's an irregular path. As soon as we detect that there's a movement in that trial that falls outside the norm, we'll trigger an alert, and that alert not only tells you what happened, but also possible interpretations of that. And if you ever worked in real-time information, one of the most complex things to do is actually not only saying that something has changed, but the context around it. So like the holy grail that we are working towards is real-time context. And so the way to accomplish that is that you think about all these variations of the trials or any other industry or domain, and then we are able to inject that context. So right now we have 70 or so different signals or different events, and each one of these events has hidden interpretation. So it could be that the trial stopped early because it couldn't get approval, or there's a substantial decrease, and that will impact the statistical power of that study. And then in addition to looking at the events individually, we are then looking at the context. So in essence, think about this as a hyper-specialized newswire for the life sciences and biotech space. This information is publicly available, but it doesn't mean that it's easy to process. And if you look at, let's say, one data source from like the FDA or any other of these regulatory bodies, often it's incomplete. So the way of mitigating that risk is to aggregate different sorts of data. I've included a lot of these case studies here just as a reference. We are also there's an application for our clients who are investors in life sciences professionals, but we also we have a partnership with Stat News to distribute the platform, and their journalists, they are also using the tool to break stories. And so using journalists as a way to validate the quality of the information, our perspective is that journalists are some of the most sophisticated knowledge workers. If it meets the sort of the acceptance criteria of journalists, then we are doing a good job. One question that we get asked often is, these case studies look great, but how do I know that you are not cherry picking? And specifically, this is like something that, when we sell this platform into hedge funds or asset management firms, they want the analytical backing that there's a correlation between the occurrence of the event and then a future outcome. So what we do is actually we replicate their processes where we simulate stock trading strategies. We don't, actually invest real money. It's all simulated. And we basically, using the information that we have at our disposal, we make bets. And so an example of this is for when we see companies with negative signals, we short the stock, meaning we bet that stock will go down. If we see the absence of those red flags, we actually, invest in that company. And then we run these simulated, trading models and basically show the impact. Obviously, it varies, and I'm oversimplifying sort of the process. But in some cases, we have seen some of these trading models showing a 20% annualized return. And obviously we use other metrics, but that's just a way for us to not only showing the value, but also proving that we are not cherry picking like these case studies. This is what the platform looks like, and we can actually do a live experimentation together, where basically you can select different companies, or you can select different diseases. For the sake of just showing you this very quickly, I selected Pfizer, and I'm selecting a few event types. Each one of these event types has about 10 different micro signals. So I'm picking what we consider red flags. So any type of early stoppage, things that are irregular trajectory in terms of status, evolution, and also timeline delays. And then the way what you are seeing on the left side is a stream of alerts that are generated by us. This is, the event data, the occurrence of this event and the magnitude of this event is proprietary to us. In other words, we are taking public data and using machine learning models to build entirely new data sets. And then on the right side, what you see is that real-time context that I was telling you about. We are describing what is this trial about, what are the possible interpretations of this type of event of multiple delays, how often it occurs. And so all of this, the raw data is text. It's like this really complex text that we basically break down, and we are monitoring for these different changes. And so for any clinical trial, and this can be done for you're tracking lawsuits or you're tracking policy, it doesn't matter, the organizing principle here is the clinical trial. We are then generating these timelines for all the events that we tracked for the clinical trial. And as I mentioned, this is an instance where you are using public data and journalism to generate new data that previously didn't exist. The way that people interact is going to the platform, and then if there's a new update on your, you can save that watch list. If there's a new update, you can basically receive alerts on your on the desktop or mobile, as well as an email briefing. I'll touch on a few more things specifically on the technical side. We use a very specific flavor of machine learning, which is called active learning, which is basically we use a human in the loop system where we show the event classification to journalists, and then they tell us, well, you did a good job, or this is not relevant. But in order to avoid the bottleneck and having and requiring a lot of data to be annotated, active learning allows you to pick a statistically representative data point that you want to improve your accuracy on. And with a limited number of inputs, you can then improve the entire category. So let's say if you're trying to classify, regulatory events, does this event relate to something that happened in terms of the regulatory nature of that drug? We pick, 2 or 3 events that are representative of the wider category, and then with a small number of annotations or data input, we can retrain the model and see increased levels of precision and recall. And so all the annotations are done by journalists. This is more of a technical overview, but the main idea here is that the platform is data agnostic. And so that means that we can quickly evolve into other areas. The area where we focus a lot of attention is building these editorial algorithms. And then I'll touch on one last thing, and then we'll open up for questions. We believe that the most impactful form of marketing is journalism. So what we do is actually we use our data to write reports and to write case studies. And we don't invest any money on traditional marketing. The marketing that we do is reporting on the data. Remember, this event data is unique to us. So if we show that data in different cuts and looking at trends, that's information that is truly impactful. I'll end this on the broader vision and what we are building towards. So I started the conversation by saying our mission is to anticipate disruptions of the health of people, places, and planet. But the ultimate goal is to be able to connect all of these different domains and essentially capture the butterfly effect. So this is real data that you are looking at, or examples of real data. These data sets are not connected, but this is real data. And so the example here is that you detect a flood in a region in India, Hyderabad, which happens to be one of the main hubs for manufacturing of main active ingredients in certain drugs. And by knowing the impact that those floods had in the infrastructure, in the electric grid, in the power supply, you can anticipate disruptions to supply chain and production. And then, 5 months later, you actually see a trial in Texas stopping early because of drug supply. They couldn't get that ingredient to manufacture the drug. So that's what we are working towards. This is extremely difficult to do if you're just trying to boil the ocean and try to do this at the same time. So the goal is do each one of these verticals extremely well, and then eventually connect them so you can basically measure the impact that events have on different industries, including life sciences. So I'll pause here. There's a lot of information, but yeah, I'd love to answer any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you, Francesco. And I'll start by asking a couple of quick questions, and then we can kind of open it up. I think my first one is sort of on the tech side. It seems like for a lot of applications of machine learning kind of related to information and news, that one of the keys to really making this work is having good sources of data. And I think it looks like you're doing a lot of interesting things of finding kind of maybe some novel data sources and kind of tuning into that, I guess. So I'm curious, just do I have that right? And also, how do you deal with kind of inconsistencies in your data sources, or when 1 month of the data doesn't show up when you're expecting it to, and things like that?
Yeah. So I think there's multiple parts to that question, but the sources we use are the same sources that a biotech investigative journalist would use. And so that means that in order to ingest any type of data, we have an editorial scoring criteria where we ask questions like the ones you are asking in terms of like, how often is it updated? What's the reliability of the system? What are potential biases that we can find in the data in terms of any types of biases, and what are the data gaps? And I'm oversimplifying. This is like basically imagine a checklist of things that we have to identify. One thing in particular that you asked is, well, what if the data is not complete? Actually, that when the data is not complete, we identify that as like a target for more data, and we look for the breadcrumbs. So, for example, you might not get information on, I don't know, a clinical trial formally starting, but you might find it in a press release from a company, or the results are not submitted to the regulatory body, but you might find that information on a scientific paper. So the investigation of, let's say, the first data source informs other data that needs to be brought into the system. And then also very importantly, it's the collaboration that we have with clients, and we consider journalists also clients, although they are not paying for the platform, where if you look at let's say a report on the clinical trials and drug development landscape from like a big consulting company or an investment bank, you can read that report and you can see that consistently these reports talk about like very specific types of events or data points. Or same thing with, if you read a news report on a particular drug. And so we identify those by doing journalistic work. And then one thing that I didn't talk about, but we also spend a lot of time doing, is the normalization of this data. Like there's 18 different ways of describing COVID-19, both in different spellings, like with a dash, without the dash, with a space, coronavirus, pandemic. So we build our own, we use, best practices in terms of leveraging existing medical taxonomies and dictionaries, but there's also things that we have to build ourselves. So in terms of like normalization of names of drugs or names of the disease, or even names of companies, like Pfizer has dozens of subsidiaries. Some of them are like Pfizer India, others have a completely different name. So there's a lot of work that goes into the normalization. In doing that, normalization can help then connect all of these different data sources. So it's the common denominator.
Great. That makes a lot of sense. So I want to ask one more question and then we can open up. I see already a hand raised, and if people want to share questions in the chat or raise your hand, we can kind of get that way. But sort of my one final question is, I know we have a lot of people in the room who are growing, their projects, whether it's internally at a news organization or sort of as a startup. I know that you're working with a lot of different types of clients, but kind of thinking maybe in particular related to stat news, like I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about when you went of sort of making this case of using AI in a news organization. Do you have any sense of what some of those things were that made them say, okay, yes, we want to work with you, not just, okay, that's cool, but what were some of the things that you all were doing in sort of pitching that kind of really got them interested in doing this pilot?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's about understanding the incentives of each stakeholder. So a stakeholder could be a partner like Stat, another stakeholder could be a client, and within the client base, there's different types of clients. So we built we built a truly collaborative relationship with Stat, almost as an extension to their data team. So we were obviously collaborating a lot on stories, and so the stories and storytelling is the currency of newsrooms. And so if you are building automation and data systems in collaboration or for newsrooms, the first stop or the first thing that you have to do is validating that whatever approach you're taking results in a story. So that's number one. And then for clients is to very early on find pilot clients. And so before starting with life sciences, we did a bunch of client work, which was more data, like building APIs and consultative in nature. And in like 8 months or so, two of us generated over $500,000 in revenue. Like this was non-recurring revenue of like paying for projects, but we used that initial funding to bootstrap our R&D and then eventually building a product. So there's these two things. There's, for us, I think the partnership with Stat has been very productive, because we understand news and understand that journalism is the final output. And then with clients, it's like, I'm sure the group here has been exposed to different methods, including design thinking, which is like to develop solutions that solve actual client problems rather than you trying to come up with a particular point of view.
Great. So let's open things up. I think Swapnil had his hand up early on, so I don't know if you want to unmute and ask your question, Swapnil, if you're ready here.
Sure, that sounds good to me. Thanks.
Sure.
Hey everyone, I'm a PhD candidate at NYU and sort of building a system to track coordinated behavior online. Really cool presentation, really cool product. The question I had was, from a retail investor, like you mentioned hedge funds and you mentioned the data sources are public. So from a retail investor perspective, I understand that they probably don't have the specialized workflow to capitalize on these kinds of insights. But I'm curious if you analyze like how soon or how much of a head start you have on institutional investors, and like considering that they might also have access to proprietary data sources in these regimes. Especially life sciences, like do you have a sense of like where you stand relative to the pipelines they've developed?
Yeah, so just to clarify, so you talked about institutional versus retail investors. Basically, are you asking about like whether both groups are using the platform? And then the second question is like how unique and proprietary our data is, more or less?
Yeah, so I guess I should boil it down. Like, would you have you thought about using you have volume data trading these sorts of company, you have data on the volume of trading for these sorts of companies online. So have you you showed us a couple of really cool case studies, but like, do you think have you looked at what head start you have on when the volume, like I'm sure other people also know like that this Hyderabad company went down, or like Hyderabad had floods and like people came up, this is going to happen. And I'm wondering how much of a head start you have on the competition in that sense. It's tangential to
yeah. So we are in terms of the event data, so like something occurred on this clinical trial, and then the magnitude of that occurrence, like there was a 80% in the patients that are being tested. That's proprietary to us. We are not integrating financial data because, you know, if you're talking to investors, everyone will have a Bloomberg terminal. We don't want to replicate a Bloomberg terminal. We want to be more of a Bloomberg terminal for alternative data of measuring the real world. So that, you know, we use the examples that I was showing you with financial data is to basically back test the validity and impact of data, but it's not that we are surfacing financial data. That's highly commoditized space. And so it's also, we ask that question of, with our point of view and skills and journalistic perspective, what's new data that we can generate on a recurring basis, and focus on that. And initially, it will have to be like highly specialized and niche, but the idea is that we'll be able to turn around and build entirely like new data sets and event detection companies at the same speed that, you know, a reporter writes a story. And basically, okay, now we are able to track, I don't know, supply chain issues of related to drug delivery. So in terms of the head start, there's not necessarily, I don't know if you're asking about like the impact of the models in financial trading, or like how much data we have that others don't. But you know, the headline here is that this type of data is proprietary to us, no one else has it. And so it's still a small domain, but you can build a lot of value by starting small and then incrementally building on top of that. Hopefully that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
I see there's a student from Rochester Institute of Technology who put a question in the chat. I don't know if, John, if you want to unmute and ask it, or I can just read it off here, but I'll invite you to say hello quickly if you do want. Or, okay, yeah.
Hi, sorry, I'm not going to be turning on the camera though.
Sure, no problem.
Really nice talk. I was very curious about the system when the topic was announced. So from a user perspective, just since this is an AI-based system, I was wondering, how are you dealing with possible predictions that are just constantly wrong? And whether there's like a system to provide confidence intervals or like likeliness of certain events to occur based on possible prerequisites that might happen in between.
Yeah. So first of all, we are not making predictions, and so that's, you know, that's clearly communicated. The other way that we, or another consideration is that all information that is algorithmically generated as a transparency disclaimer that like this information was generated by a machine. But to answer your question about like the confidence interval, we have event impact score that basically triggers whether you should receive an alert or not. But it's not that we are then saying, well, this alert resulted in, you know, the stock going up or down or this drug failing. We are not doing that. The goal is to have the first line of monitoring and being the first to surface these red flags. And then since we are dealing with highly specialized clients and users, it's up to them to then triangulate with their own sources and use their information networks to then make a decision. Otherwise, that's, if you start doing specifically in the healthcare space, if you start doing predictions, that's a recipe for lawsuits and liability. So we are very clear that we are not doing predictions. It's more about how can we essentially reduce the emotional intensity of information. And what I mean by that is, let's say a trial fails and the drug doesn't work. If you only receive that information when that final information, the trial failed, it's high emotional intensity, as compared to if you're throughout the process, maybe you've signaled 2 or 3 red flags that can help you anticipate that actually maybe something might not be going according to plan. The confidence score idea is something that actually we have debated whether we should, that event impact score that we have internally, whether that should be something that we show to the user. Right now we don't, but I think that's also an editorial question.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
So I think we probably have time for about 1 or 2 more questions. So if anyone has other questions about AppliedXL, or if okay, I see one from Mike. Mike, do you want to ask that yourself? Feel free to unmute if so. Yeah.
Sure. Hello, Francesco. How do you deal with
Mike.
people planting false red flags to throw off the system?
Yeah, that's a great question. So an example of that is that, for example, for press release data, often what the biotech companies will do is not necessarily false information, but they will add a lot of spin to the press release. So let's say the trial fails in the US, and then the headline it's not like trial fails, it's company X, Y, and Z is being very successful in enrolling patients in Europe. Something completely different and then towards the final paragraph, they'll say, and by the way, this trial in the US didn't work. And so that's like the closest in terms of like planting false red flags. And one way of doing that is that building event classification systems that take into account spin. Like there's so much spin. If it's from an announcement from the company, like the way it's written, it's completely different than like the formal, report that is submitted to the regulatory body. In terms of planting false signals, since we are dealing with highly regulated industry, that doesn't occur as much on the source data. If you're like, monitoring, US health agencies or regulatory agencies that you have to submit, because otherwise that would just mean the companies are breaking the laws. But in terms of the companies themselves, we see that all the time. And so the way of addressing that is to build spin or BS detector models.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mike.
Great. Maybe I'll ask one final sort of quick thing, just kind of looking forward, Francesco. I'm curious what sort of, if you can stay kind of on the roadmap for you all next with AppliedXL over the next, year or so, what are some of the next steps to building the company, either just strategically or with the tech that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, I mean, so next year we'll be focusing on continuing to grow our client base in life sciences, and so that includes obviously continuous improvements to the product, but also the detection of new types of events within that domain. And then towards the end of next year, start building out the next vertical around supply chain and transportation. And right now we are scaling the product and sales team. But what we are all really excited and passionate about is, and it's also a moonshot, is this idea of pre-news, and being able to apply these methodologies across the board. And so if you're just think about this, we need good information, and we need that information to help prepare for disruptions. The probability of global pandemics will go up. We have a crumbling infrastructure, so there will be more and more issues to supply chain. And we have the impact and dangers of climate change and other environmental impacts. And so good information, preemptive information, plays a vital role in addressing, the biggest challenges society has ever experienced. And so that's why building pre-news systems is so important, so we can equip decision makers and leaders with that information so they can then quickly address those disruptions.
Great. That makes a lot of sense. And, we're looking forward to following that trajectory and what you all are up to next with AppliedXL. So I think we'll sort of wrap up here, but thank you again, Francesco, for joining us and sharing all the work that you're up to. I feel like this is just such a interesting case study for us to follow in sort of applying machine learning to developing, these pre-news sources. And I'm sure we'll all be following your work. And
yes.
Yeah. And
thank
also
you so much for having me. And I know there's a lot of students, a lot of news professionals, technology professionals in the meeting today. So if you have questions or ideas, you're looking for collaborations, you can email me at francesco@appliedxl.com. And looking forward to staying in touch. And thank you so much all for your time today.